What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the first-person shooter tutorial series, we're going to be going over burst weapons. So we technically had burst weapons in the series at this point, but really all it did was shoot a projectile, hit scan projectile, one time, and take away 3 ammo. We can improve upon this greatly by actually making the weapon shoot the appropriate amount of times and take ammo each time a bullet or projectile is fired. You can see I can shoot this zombie 3 times, and he takes 3 different sets of damages. There are also 3 different hit scans that occur. So if I am to do it like that, you can see 3 distinct lines each time I fire. Of course, we will make this configurable so you can choose the time between the projectiles as well as the number of projectiles in the burst. Now, before we get into this episode, if you want to get caught up in the series before checking this out, you can click this link in the top right corner right here to check out every single episode of the first-person shooter tutorial series. Alternatively, if you just care about burst weapons, I do recommend you check out this episode right here where we initially set up the behavior for the burst weapons, because some of that behavior is still going to be accurate. We're just going to be expanding upon that today. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started on the episode. So this is a code and blueprint tutorial, and today we're going to start in the code. So I'm going to go to the code, and I'm going to go to my base weapon.h, which is my default weapon or my wrapper class weapon that all other weapons are children of. In here, we had something called E-weapon mode, which was single, burst, or auto. So we had single fire, burst fire or semi-auto, and then auto, which is just for automatic. We already had this burst fire, and we had the assault rifle set to the burst mode. But now we're going to improve it further. I'm going to scroll down to my variables, and I want to go to where we want to add some variables for bursting or semi-automatic weapons. Specifically, I would like to add 2 integers, and they're going to keep track of the number of projectiles that we fired, as well as how many we should fire. So the first one here, int burst fire num, is the number of projectiles that are fired in one burst of a burst fire weapon. So for example, if it is a 2-round burst, a 3-round burst, then you shoot 2 or 3 projectiles on each burst. You could technically do a 20-round burst, and then you would shoot 20 projectiles on one burst. This can absolutely be different for each weapon. So I'm going to make sure I add this U property line. U property, edit anywhere, blueprint read write, and give it a category of weapon. This way we can change this value in the blueprints for each weapon that we have. So any other burst fire weapons, change this variable's value to reflect how many projectiles should be shot when firing from a burst fire weapon. Now I also have another integer here, and this is just going to track the current number of projectiles that have been shot in this burst. This is important because when we call our fire function to actually reduce the amount of ammo remaining in the clip and actually create the hit scans, we want to know when to stop. And if we don't have an actual tracker, we can't know how many we've done so far to get to this burst fire num. Now, technically we could just loop through it and call this timer every time we loop, but there's an easier way to do this. If we just keep track of the current number of projectiles fired, we can keep our current timer method and only allow that timer to trigger as many times as we want by tracking how many we already have and the maximum amount that we should have in one burst. So I call this int current burst projectiles fired. We need 2 integers, a maximum, and a current number of projectiles fired during a burst. Now if we scroll down to the float values here, I've added a new one for today's episode, and this one is called float burst fire time between. And this is the time between projectiles fired during a burst fire. Additionally, I say that -1.0 for non-burst firing. So this is important. This is only for if we have a burst fire weapon, and it's how long in between we should wait between firing projectile 1 and then projectile 2 during a burst. This is basically the fire rate, but I did make it its own variable because in the future we may have weapons that have automatic and semi-automatic mode, and so their fire rate is going to be different from their burst fire rate. And so if the weapon, since this is the base weapon class, doesn't have the burst fire mode, we can set this to -1.0 and we'll just ignore any behavior with this. But if we do have a burst fire mode, then we'll use this burst fire time between to determine how far apart the projectile should be in the burst. Typically they're really close together, but you can still configure it and each weapon can still be different. So again, this is float burst fire time between, and I did make this AU property so that we can change this for every single weapon. That is edit anywhere, blueprint read write with a category of weapon. Now lastly, I want to add a timer for today that I call the burst fire timer handle. So F timer handle, burst fire timer handle. And quite literally, it's the timer handle for burst fire weapons when firing. Basically, this is going to determine when we should shoot each projectile when in a burst fire mode or with a burst fire weapon. This doesn't need to be U property, so we can go ahead and skip that. And then once we've made all 4 of these variables, let's go into the base weapon.cpp. In here, we want to go to our constructor, the first function here, where we set all of our default values, and we want to set values for all of the variables that we just made, except for the timer. We don't need to set that one. So looking at my variables here, I have my burst fire num, my burst fire time between. So burst fire num I have set to 1 by default. First of all, if this isn't a burst fire weapon, if it's 1, this means we only shoot 1 projectile for each burst. Now the burst logic won't be going off anyway if it's not a burst fire weapon or a semi-automatic weapon, so we don't care what this value is, but I don't want to set it to 0 just in case any mistakes happen or any bugs in our code exist. If we set it to 0 and we're trying to use a burst weapon, then we won't be able to shoot with our weapon at all. Worst case scenario, we only shoot 1 bullet with our weapon, which is perfectly fine. We'll know something's wrong, but at least the user can still use the weapon. So I like 1 as a nice safeguard, but you can set this at 0 if you'd like. The burst fire time between I set to -1.0 by default. Remember that this is the base weapon, and most of our weapons likely aren't burst weapons. So by default, I don't want to have a burst fire time between so that we can just skip any logic related to burst fire. But of course, each weapon will be updated individually, and if this value is set to something else, we will use the appropriate time. Now, I didn't actually set this in here prior, but we should set the current burst projectiles fired and set that to 0 by default. Just because when the weapon spawns in, none of the burst projectiles have been fired out of the weapon, so we start at 0. Now, once we've set up all of our default values in the constructor, we can scroll down to our fire function. This function we made in previous episodes of the series, and basically we go through the weapon mode to determine what type of weapon it is or what mode the weapon is on right now. So single, burst, and automatic. The single and the auto are going to be left alone for today's episode. The burst needs an update. So previously in the series, we were doing these 2 commented outlines, and that was very simple, but it's not advanced enough for our needs. So what I'm going to do today to change this is, instead of just calling fire weapon and subtracting the ammo, let's actually call the weapon the amount of times that we would expect, and let's decrease ammo every time it gets called. So I'm going to remove the commented out logic, the old logic that we had for the burst, and instead I'm going to check if the current burst projectiles fired is less than the burst fire num. Basically, we're checking how many of the projectiles from the burst have been fired already. Is it equal to the maximum or over it? If so, we're going to skip this if statement. But if not, we're still in the burst, or we're starting the burst. And so we want to start spawning projectiles and call the fire weapon and decrease the ammo just like usual. And we're going to start our timer. The reason we're setting a timer here is because we want to call fire, which is the function we're currently in, but we only want to call it at that given interval. We don't want to let it loop forever. We only want to let it loop as many times as we have in the burst. So if it's a 3-round burst, we want to let it loop 3 times. And we don't want them to all happen instantly. We want them to happen at the interval we provided. So a timer is perfect for this. And to set a timer, we can use getWorld, arrow, getTimerManager, .setTimer. Now, this set timer function has quite a few parameters, but it's actually quite simple what we're doing. Basically, we need a timer handle to be able to start, stop, pause, grab data from the current timer that is running here. And so our burst fire timer handle that we made is going to fit perfectly in that spot. That's the first parameter. The next is the object that this is going to be called on. And not only do we want the base weapon to be the one with the timer called on it, but the function is going to be called from base weapon. or this class. So we can just pass in this, which refers to this class and this object that we're in. So this base weapon. In the case of the tutorial series, my assault rifle is my burst weapon, so technically it'll be passing in the burst weapon here. Then we have the action that we want to occur, or really the function we want to call when this timer finishes and is ready to perform the logic that we want to happen. And again, we're just going to call this same function over and over while doing the burst. So we want to pass in ampersand, a base weapon, : fire. The reason it's set up like this and not just fire like other function calls is because you can call other functions from other classes. So you pass it like this and it knows exactly the class and the function that we're calling. Now we need the intervals. So how often should this timer be called? And we set up a variable for that. That is our burst fire time between float that we made earlier. So pass that along. And then the last parameter that I'm using here is if it should loop or not. As you can see here, it says in B loop true to keep firing at rate intervals, false that fire only once. We do want it to keep firing at rate intervals, so basically every time it gets to this function and on this line, allow it to continue to fire, but we will manually block the logic. We won't let it get to this line if we reached our maximum amount of projectiles in this burst, so it won't loop forever as long as we do our behavior correctly. When it gets to this line, though, it is good to keep looping until we tell it to stop. So that's our timer set up. Now, once we trigger this timer, I'm going to go ahead and increase the amount of burst projectiles fired at this point. So ++ current burst projectiles fired. We're firing our first projectile from this burst, so we just want to keep track of that. Now we want to do the regular logic that we do for both single and automatic, which is where we call the fire weapon function. Note that fire weapon is different from fire. Fire weapon is a blueprint implementable event. This is where we actually spawn the projectiles, or in this case spawn a ray trace that we use, as well as some other visual effects and things like that. So this is for extra behavior for firing the weapon, and that's all been covered in other parts of the tutorial series, and I'm not going to be going over it today. But we are going to still want to call that function right now. And now we want to take one clip ammo away. You'll notice all three of these cases take one clip ammo away. I'm not taking 3 away anymore because I'm not doing it all at once. Every time we go through this timer, call this function, go through here, we're going to take 1 ammo away. This looks much nicer when in game because you can see the projectile count going down as the ray traces are coming out. So as we're shooting, our ammo is going down. This is all we need for when we should perform a burst fire here. But if this condition is not true, so if the current burst projectiles fired is either equal to burst fire num or greater than burst fire num, we will go into this else statement right here. In the else statement, that means we've reached all the projectiles we need to fire for this burst, and so we want to stop the timer handle from trying to call the function again and from looping. At this point, we're going to just release the timer handle, and to do that, we can clear it. So we can do get world, arrow, get timer manager, dot clear timer, and we can pass along our timer that we had set, which is the burst fire timer handle. So when we do this, the timer handle will no longer be trying to call this function at this interval, and it won't be looping. It'll just stop, and it will wait for the next time we give it a command. Then after that, we can reset the current burst projectiles fired back to 0, because at this point, we're no longer in a burst, and we need to be ready for the next burst if the player fires another burst weapon. So just reset it back to 0. Now, whether the if or the else is taken, we still want to break at the end of the switch statement. That way we don't spill over into the automatic logic. If we don't have this break, you'll do this logic and then go into the automatic. So make sure you have this break at the end. And once you've done this, you are good to go for the code. Now let's launch the editor, and I'll catch back up with you in a minute. Alright, the editor is back open, and so now we want to go to each of our weapons. Specifically, we're going to want to go to our weapons that are burst, but we can go to all of them. So let's go to our base weapon BP first. And this is my parent weapon, but I technically use it as my blaster as well. So now if you go to the class defaults in your blueprint and look at the details panel, you can see some of the new variables that we added, specifically the burst fire num and the burst fire time between. By default, the burst fire num is going to be 1, and the burst fire time between is going to be -1. For single fire weapons, like the base weapon BP, this is perfectly fine, so I'm going to leave it alone. Let's go to the submachine gun BP, which is fully automatic, and do the same thing. Burst fire num is 1, good. Burst fire time between, -1, good. Now let's go to our burst weapon, which is my assault rifle BP, and look at the class defaults in here, and you can see that I have burst fire num, I've set it to be 3, meaning I fire 3 projectiles during one burst. Burst fire time between, I have 0.1, so 0.1 seconds apart are when the projectiles fire during the burst. You saw what it looked like earlier, but I'll give you a quick demo again. So if I pick up my assault rifle, this is what it looks like. If I decide to change these values, go to my assault rifle BP and I say burst fire num 10 and compile that and launch this, I will shoot 10 projectiles in one burst. And you can see that is actually happening. The ammo is deducting 10 times and 10 projectiles are shot. Now this allows us to go over our total amount of ammo in the magazine or in the clip. See that? So I have -6 ammo. Now next time I go to shoot, I do have to reload, but we shouldn't allow them to go over that if they don't have enough ammo to do so. You could either let them shoot the remaining bullets in the clip or the magazine, or you could not let them shoot at all. That is up to you. We'll go over that in just a second. Now going back to this, we could also change this. So if I say burst fire num is 3 again, but I set the burst fire time between to be 0.5, it will only fire each projectile at half a second. It'll take that long between. So that's not me shooting individually, that's part of the burst, but you see how far apart they are. You have full control over the burst fire weapons now, and that feels pretty good. Now additionally, I'm getting one bug for my burst fire, and specifically this is with the break hit result hit component. So if there is not a hit result from our weapon, when we are creating the line trace, we weren't using this return value to see if there was a hit, and we were just breaking the hit. That will cause a null error, so let's go ahead and do this in our create ray trace function for the blueprint for the base weapon BP. I'm going to go ahead and just check to see that the return value is true. There was a hit. If not, we're just going to leave it alone, but if there was a hit, we're going to do this logic just to ignore that error, because if we're breaking the hit and we didn't actually hit anything, then data like the location, the component, and the actor are going to be null, which is going to cause an error. Again, this is in my base weapon BP create ray trace function. We set this up earlier in the series. If you don't have this, or you have your own behavior for ray traces, then you can go ahead and ignore that, but that will get rid of that error that you were seeing on my screen. Now the last thing we want to do is update our burst to not work if we're out of ammo. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to Visual Studio and go to baseweapon.cpp, go to the burst logic, and I'm actually just going to add it right here in this if statement. So if current burst projectiles fired is less than burst fire num and clip ammo greater than 0. Because if we come in here and clip ammo is not greater than 0, that means we are out of ammo in this clip or in this magazine. So when we go into this else statement, it will reset this behavior, and then next time we go to shoot, it will reload for us, which is what we want. So after that adjustment, let's play again. Now the editor is back open again, so let's change that burst fire num back to something like 10, and let's try our logic out. So I'm going to go grab my burst fire weapon. I'm going to shoot in 10 times. It's still at that half a second interval, but you can see it working. We can do it again. And now on this next one, we should go into the negative, right? Well, actually no, because it should stop at 0 as it did. And now when I go to shoot, I can reload. Of course, I can also reload manually. So I'm going to switch my values back. My burst fire is going to have 3 at 0.1 second intervals. And now when I come into the game, this is what it looks like. And our burst fire weapon is now fully working and fully configurable. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed. And if you did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do. I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon members and supporters. You guys are so amazing, and I really, really appreciate you guys keeping this series alive. Thank you for all the love and support, my friends. If you had any issues while following this tutorial, feel free to join the Discord community. I will happily help you, and it is completely free. And anyway, guys, like I said, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.